interesting stuff about our local history, Forest Hills. So I'm Helen Day, and I'm Vice President of the Friends of Maple Grove, and we are the volunteer organization attached to Maple Grove Cemetery who brings you as many cultural events as we can possibly cram into a year. So I think we had about 60 events last year and the year before, so we're trying to see if we can match that. But each one is something that we work hard on and that we're very happy to present to our friends and neighbors here in Kew Gardens. So downstairs you may have seen our World War II exhibit. Today is Flag Day. It's the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. So there's lots of things to celebrate. And we also have just released a book on the 27 men from Kew Gardens who died in World War II, and that was also the reason for having our World War II exhibit downstairs today. So, and now we come to Forest Hills, so it's exciting to be able to hear about our history and to find out about the lost landmarks that are here in Forest Hills. We all cherish our neighborhoods and places where we've lived and where we've grown up, and often there are things in our memory that are no longer there. So we like to bring them to the forefront sometimes and take a look at them and say, yes, you know, we remember them and appreciate them, and hopefully we can preserve more of what's left for the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nick Hirshon, our author. And thank you so much for Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you all for being here today. So, as Helen mentioned, my name is Nick Hirshon. I was born in Flushing, raised in Forest Hills, which is what led to the presentation that I'm going to be talking to you about today. And a lot of this is based on a book that I wrote in 2013 called Images of America, Forest Hills, which I've got up here in the front. So it's been a while since I've written this book, and since the time that I wrote it, at that time actually, I had been a reporter for the New York Daily News. I'm going to talk about some of the reporting that I did about historic sites that were under threat of being demolished. Some unfortunately have since been demolished. Some have been saved from the wrecking ball, so that's great. And then some other places outside of Forest Hills that I've covered that I wanted to end on a positive note of, even though we are going to be talking about some places that we have lost, there are some that thankfully still remain and we can still go visit and enjoy. So I start out with this slide. Yeah, it wasn't on. Now it's on. So I start out with, now you can hear, sorry, it's too loud now. So I start out with this slide. So I was going to ask you, I knew there's one on the right that's a little bit obvious, but do you recognize any of the landmarks that are in here that I'm going to be talking about that no longer exist? Mm-hmm. So this one on the right we know is
Trilon Movies.
The Trilon Movie Theater on Queens Boulevard. That's sadly gone. I'm going to be going through them in more detail. Does anyone happen to know what the other two are? Those are a little bit trickier. Yeah?
Keller House.
Yeah, that's the one in the middle, is the former home of Helen Keller, which is now the Reformed Temple of Forest Hills. And then the one on the left, if you know that one, then you were just in my home earlier looking at me put together the presentation. So that would be a little bit too far afield. But these are some that I thought would be neat to kind of focus on today. So as we get started, excuse my reach here. So first off, kind of not so noble character that we're beginning with. So as you may know from, I'm sure many of you have gone to many events at Maple Grove Cemetery, so we always have to make sure that we are dedicating the presentation to somebody who is a permanent resident of Maple Grove. Carl, I asked Carl, so who should we do for this particular event? And he nominated Frank Erickson. So I was thinking about this as we were coming out here today. So you all came out here today, in the rain. You trudged here to honor a mobster, Frank Erickson, who is buried in Maple Grove. So a mobster who was considered one of the most notorious bookmakers of the 1930s and 1940s. I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective on him, and yes, he did live in Forest Hills, and ironically, although Helen Keller's house was torn down, you can still go visit Frank Erickson's. It still remains. So I guess if you want to have a legacy that really is sturdy, you've got to break the rules sometimes, and his house is still there on Greenway South. So I'll tell you a little bit about that later on. I'll show you a photograph. But so you see the mobster and bookmaker, I tried to use fonts that would evoke gangland kind of stuff. So I think I have a video here to give you a little bit more about who Frank Erickson is.
1950s, New York, in a city buzzing with gamblers and gangsters, one man ruled the underground without ever showing his face. Frank Erickson. They called him the Phantom Bookie. He ran a massive betting operation, millions of dollars on the line. But here's the twist. No office, no phone number, no trace, just whispered instructions and cash that flowed like a river. Gamblers placed their bets, thinking they were in on the action. Instead, Erickson's crew pocketed the money and disappeared. Over $10 million stolen, without firing a single shot. And when the gamblers realised they were conned, too bad, the Phantom was already gone. Cops knew his name, but chasing him was like chasing smoke. Every lead led to another dead end. Some say he lived like a king, others claim he stayed hidden for life. Either way, he rewrote the rule book for criminal masterminds.
So certainly an interesting person for us to be starting off with here. So I was looking into a little bit of Frank Erickson's history and how he was covered by the press over the years. My background, I told you I was a reporter for the New York Daily News. I'm now a journalism professor at William Patterson University in Wayne, New Jersey. It's about 20 miles west of the city. And so I'm always looking through old newspaper articles to see like how is this person covered at the time. So I was able to dredge up some things about Frank Erickson that I will pull up for you here. One of the interesting notes about him, and this is a story that was told a lot when he passed away, and there were all these obituaries written about him from coast to coast, was that apparently he got his start in gangland stuff he was a waiter at a restaurant as a young boy, wasn't making a lot of money, he was on Coney Island, and one of the patrons said, "Hey kid, could you go place a bet for me at on the horse race?" And he paid a young Frank Erickson to do this. Erickson ran over with the money, but the gambling place had already closed, like illegal gambling den was already closed. So he just pocketed the money, never placed the bet, and that was the start of his gambling career, so to speak. So look at some of these images here.
1950.
So a little bit of like how he's been covered over the years. So you see there, I just took kind of a collection of different headlines from when he was most in the news. So in the mid-30s, there were a bunch of trials about since he was a bookmaker and kind of didn't like the limelight, there was a lot of talk about how, he's maybe somebody who, is murky. They mentioned in that video that he's kind of caught up in smoke. And so he wasn't always getting photographed that much, but there were these trials that were looking into there was actually a trial of the district attorney and whether he was corrupt, and then he was said, well, I'm not corrupt, I'm friends with Frank Erickson. I don't really know if that's a good defense. But then you see a few years after this trial in 1940, talking about this prison term, although here they identified him as a New Jersey bookmaker. Hey, he's one of ours. You can't claim him Jersey. He's a Forest Hills guy. But was convicted of second-degree perjury several weeks ago and ended up in jail. One of the interesting things about Erickson's story is that he was a sworn enemy of Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York. And one of LaGuardia, this is very 1920s, 1930s slang, that apparently LaGuardia kept referring to Erickson as a tin-horned punk. And I don't know if you've ever heard that term before, but apparently tin horn was a 1920s, roaring 20s kind of slang, meaning somebody who acts like they're a real big shot but is really a phony. And you know what a punk is. But I thought that was kind of what a old-fashioned, so if you ever want to tell someone off and not have them know what it means, they're a tin horn punk. So this is the New York Daily News. I believe this is 1941. So you're seeing here that this is actually the way it was folded out, so I scanned the two different pages of the paper there. So you're seeing the Little Flower, which was Fiorello LaGuardia's nickname, Little Flower versus Big Bookmaker. These actually aren't Erickson. That all the way on the left there's Erickson. And there's LaGuardia looking very unhappy talking about him. And then I pulled the actual article that was underneath. This was a big, big spread in the paper. So there's an article that was underneath this that I wanted you to be able to see a little bit more closely. So LaGuardia is out to get fabulous Frank Erickson. Merfield, LaGuardia's friends and admirers enthusiastically applaud his 5-year effort to jail Frank Erickson. Although this is another piece of slang that I don't know if you are familiar with, but at the end of this, they mentioned all this thing about a bum and a tin horn gambler. At that time he wasn't a punk, just a gambler. But then they say that some people insist that LaGuardia's persecution of Erickson isn't quite cricket. Have you ever heard that term?
Yeah.
That something isn't cricket? So that's like isn't kosher, isn't quite just. Fake news. That's kind of like, I guess, what they would have said in that era. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So he did make a lot of the headlines of that time, but obviously not for some great things. But we want to now connect him to Forest Hills, right? So maybe you passed by this house at some point. So this is the house that he lived at 105 Greenway South from 1928 to 1963. So it's quite a nice looking home. It had, they described it in a lot of the news coverage at the time as a mansion, as a medieval style mansion. And it, now again, today it would be like $75,000, that's a steal. But in that era, apparently it was about multiples of what the other homes around it were going for. It came outfitted with a gambling den in the basement. So he would do a lot of his illegal work here over the years. I already mentioned some of the stuff about LaGuardia's effort to kind of, shut him down. But I thought that's I don't know, anyone ever passed this home before? There's so many gorgeous homes on Greenway South. And when I was doing some research, make sure, we're talking lost landmarks of Forest Hills here. Is this a lost landmark? No, you could still go there. So we'll do a field trip right after and pay tribute to Frank Erickson. So yeah, and another nickname that he had was Uncle Frank, for those who didn't want to call him Tin Horn Punk. But we're going to get into some other folks. We're going to move on from Frank, so we dedicate today to him, apparently. But we're going to move on to some people who I think you've heard a little bit more of. And this, this next one gets into the image that I showed you that was all the way on the left-hand side. We identified Helen Keller was in the middle. The Trial Theater was on the right. There was one on the left-hand side that I didn't think you were going to get. It was the home of Al Jolson. So, little known fact, Al Jolson, the singer, the vaudeville entertainer, the greatest entertainer on earth, lived in Forest Hills, or at least owned a house there. We're not quite sure how much time he spent in Forest Hills, but he did have a home here. And one of the interesting legacies of it is that when the Great Depression hit, and a lot of these entertainers were out on the street, because he had owned so much real estate, Al Jolson still died wealthy and still was able to maintain it. So just a little bit of background on Al Jolson for those folks who might not know too much about him. So starred in the Jazz Singer's most famous movie, right, the first talkie film. So that's obviously a big claim to fame for him. Now, if you know a little bit about Al Jolson's legacy, it is mixed. So we know of him as this great entertainer for generations. But as you're going to see it, I'm going to play a video for some of you to learn a little bit more about Al Jolson, or he was known for the song Swanee, and there's a lot of videos you can find of him, but he performed very often in blackface. And so actually when I was trying to find images of him for this presentation, almost all times, including on his album covers, would be blackface and the exaggerated lips and that sort of stuff. So I'm going to play for you a clip that gives a little bit of Al Jolson's background. It's a newsreel from his funeral. And when they show you that, they're also going to show you bits of him performing, and just a warning that it does show him in blackface, because that's what he was best known for in that period. But I'll play that, and then I'll show you a little bit more about his home and what ended up happening to it.
In Hollywood, tens of thousands, including the great of the entertainment world, pay their final respects to Al Jolson, the immigrant rabbi's son who brought so much happiness to 2 full generations of Americans. He had just returned from Korea, to which he had flown at his own expense, to bring to soldiers overseas, as he had in 2 earlier world wars, the songs he had made famous. Songs he first brought to the screen a quarter-century ago as a star of the world's first talking picture, Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer. For millions, the final curtain will never fall on Al Jolson.
So a little bit of an Al Jolson performance there. And obviously the time that he was performing a lot different than ours of what's socially accepted. So the home in Forest Hills, which this does no longer exist. So he owned this home at 6812 110th Street. So that's in like the Cord Meyer section that's closer to the Grand Central on the other side of Queens Boulevard. So it had, as you can kind of see there, and again it was stenciled in that initial slide if you recall, had a brick facade, stained glass bay window, flagstone roof line, and the Corbello chimney. If you'll see it better in another image that I have of the chimney. So, you know, when I was, some of this I'm going to like relate to the reporting that I was doing for the Daily News. So in 2007, I had this idea. I was working in the Queens Bureau of the Daily News, which was also happened to be in Forest Hills at the corner of Union Turnpike and Queens Boulevard. And I wanted to write a series called History in Peril about sites in Queens that never earned city landmark status and weren't protected from demolition, but seemed to have a lot of cultural and architectural significance. One of them that came up because it had just been under like demolition right around that time was this former home of Al Jolson. And I hadn't realized it at the time, but there actually was a landmarking effort about 15 years earlier to save it, and it never went through. And if you recall, this time around 2000, mid-2000s, this is a period when there was a lot of redevelopment in Cord Meyer, a lot of the McMansions going up in that area. And that's what happened with this particular home. Now again, like I told you, this is a home that Jolson bought. We're not 100% sure like how much time he really spent there because he was very wealthy, so he had a lot of homes. And apparently there was one newspaper article I found when I was researching this. There wasn't really much written about his time in Forest Hills. There was one that said he was about to move into Forest Hills and then he found a home in Scarsdale that he liked better. So this one newspaper in Scarsdale was delighting in the fact that they had beat out Forest Hills for Al Jolson's residence. You know I remember this, although I couldn't find like evidence of it. I think at one point it was a New York Times article that I found when I was researching back in 2007 that there had been a robbery at the home and that there was a bunch of paintings that Al Jolson had that were very expensive that had been stolen. And I remember that I couldn't find it unfortunately for this presentation, but I remember in my mind like seeing a photograph of a bunch of police officers in the home, like looking through all this stuff. But again, I don't think, Jolson was not there at the time that the robbery happened and wasn't affected in that way. So here's just the last kind of image of that where you see a different kind of angle of the home. And there are a lot of these homes that are kind of similar that were in that area, and some still remain, thankfully. Some have been taken down. That was one of the few posters I could find of Al Jolson on in blackface. But yeah, you can see the kind of nice architectural detail, which we're going to see is similar in some ways to Helen Keller, who was not that far away from Al Jolson. They might have been overlapping a little bit during that time. But this house, this is a photograph that was taken by someone in 2006, right before it was destroyed, which is a shame. I also learned in researching this presentation that there was someone else famous who owned this home. So before we move on to this, there was someone else famous who owned this home after Al Jolson, the actor Don Amici. So it's interesting that there was this legacy of like more than one famous person living in the same place. So Don Amici, who is probably best known for the story of Alexander Graham Bell, and that for many years people associated the telephone so much that they would call it an Amici and say that. So that was, now that's kind of fallen out of favor, but if you actually look at some movies from like the 40s and 50s, they'll still like say like, oh, can you get like the Amici, what they're still referring to because he played Graham Bell in the movie. Now for our later generations, remember him more for Trading Places when he was an old man, and then he made a cameo appearance in Coming to America of Eddie Murphy. And so So he kind of spanned the generations there. He had this lull in his career and then kind of came up. So, but again, with both Amici and Jolson, there aren't many, or I couldn't find any photographs of them in those homes. So were they just investments? And but still interesting. This one home that is no more had the connection to two very famous people. So now we're going to move on to Helen Keller. So this one really struck me when I found out that this home had been destroyed. It seemed like if this was anywhere else in the country, there would have been some sort of a movement, or there would be some effort to preserve this house, given the international acclaim of Helen Keller. The fact that this is gone and that it was such a gorgeous home, it just really pains me to think about lesser known people whose homes are now museums and tourist attractions that bring a lot to the local economy and all of that. So Helen Keller, many of you I'm sure know her story, but essentially she was blind from age 19 months, and she learned to communicate, graduated from college, became a global advocate for people with disabilities. So she was blind and deaf, and as they said at the time, dumb or mute, and became this author and activist. And it's really wild looking through all of the newspaper articles, again, of her many journeys, and she would go internationally regularly. I was reading some of these stories where she just returned from the airport and newspaper reporters are hounding her, and she's saying, yeah, I'm not. They're asking her, hey, you just returned from East Asia, are you going back there? And she's and she's literally saying, I'm tired, I want to go home. So this is a photograph that shows her in Forest Hills. This is Helen Keller at her typewriter in the home. So that's pretty neat. And the American Foundation for the Blind has an archive of a lot of her letters where she writes from Forest Hills. Back in that time, it was traditional to say Forest Hills LI, instead of thinking about it as a part of New York City. People wrote Long Island a lot. But it's really neat to see it in her own handwriting. And we're going to see some later, but she lived there with her teacher, Anne Sullivan, who was also very famous and became part of the movie The Miracle Worker, if you ever saw that. So this is going to be a video where we're going to see Helen Keller with Anne Sullivan, and they're doing a little demonstration of how Anne Sullivan taught Helen Keller to communicate. So again, this is dated. This is a newsreel from Fox Movie Tone, where at one point, I think there maybe more than once, they refer to it as being dumb, which we now know we don't refer to it as dumb, but mute. But it's pretty neat. And it's also, this was a video that is made for people with disabilities. So as they are doing certain things, there's someone who also announces what it is in case someone who's blind is watching this. So you just might hear some of that.
When Keller learned to talk, Mrs. Macy and the famous deaf, dumb, and blind people she has taught for years give you a demonstration. Now, Anne Sullivan.
When I saw Helen Keller first, she was 6 years and 8 months old. She had been blind and deaf and mute since her 19th month as the result of an illness. She had no way of communicating with those around her except the few imitative signs that she had made for herself. A push meant go, pull meant come, and so on. She had observed that we did not use the hand when we were talking to each other. And I let her see by putting her hand on my face.
Helen places her open hand over Anne's face.
She felt the vibration of the spoken word. Instantly, she spelled, I want to talk with my mouth.
Helen smiles.
That seemed impossible. But after experimenting for a time, we found that placing her hand in this position, the thumb resting on the throat, right at the larynx, the first finger on the lips, the second on the nose, we found that she could feel the vibration of spoken words. For instance, the throat, she feels the G, the hard G, G. And on the lips,
Helen repeats after Anne.
the K sound. On the lips, she feels the V and the second finger on the nose, the nasal sound, the 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 first word she learned to articulate was the little word it. With the hand in this position, I made the vowel I. She felt it. I. Then I made the T. She feels it with the finger on her lips, on my lips. Then I put the two letters together to form the word it, and the first word was learned.
Anne smiles.
After her seventh lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word. I am none, done, now.
Helen smiles.
I mean, it's so amazing to think about the way she was learning that and all the tools that we have now, and it's still very difficult to think about in that era. You know, how brave she was, and just like how smart she must have been to like learn all of these symbols, and when they were showing like how she's learning it by placing her finger, I mean, wow, what she must have gone through. So that's really neat. Oops, did it? Oh, it's just the black because we're at the end of the slide. So this is the home that existed in Forest Hills. You know, I always look at this one and think like, it's such a gorgeous home. It just evokes the image of a lot of historic sites that I've been to around the country, around the world. And I can only imagine, given the meaning that she has for so many people, how many folks would be coming to see this now. That, you know, it's such a beautiful home. She called it Castle on the Marsh. And I have a slide that's going to give you a little bit more information about that. When I first found out about it, I also wondered, oh, was Helen Keller like a temporary resident of Forest Hills, and that's why maybe we haven't heard so much about it? But no, like she, and unlike Al Jolson, we know that she actually lived in this home, and we have tons of photos of her in Forest Hills. And again, we're looking at a period of 21 years or something, that she lived there. So, you know, this is a critical time in her life. At that point, that was known as Seminole Avenue. It's now 112th Street, so we saw Jolson as 110th. That's very close to each other. And some of the architectural details, you see the towering gables, Bloom School architecture led her to call it Castle on the Marsh. She lived there with Anne Sullivan as well as her secretary. And this is really where she did a lot of her advocacy for the Foundation for the Blind, and left a lot of those letters and photographs to them today. So when I was doing research back in 07, 08 about this, they were very helpful in giving me access to some of that. And it's all, a lot of it is digitized, so if you ever want to look and see some of her letters. This is a photograph that shows her in the home. Again, this is her in Forest Hills. I was trying to look for photos of that specifically. And you know, you can see all the books on the shelf and her reading to children. So yeah, and the dog. So yeah, really great images that we actually have of her in Forest Hills. Again, looking at the newspaper history, you have to have really bad karma after stealing from Helen Keller's home. So 1921 story about when they were out for the weekend, and burglars came in there and took some jewelry and other apparel, they said, valued at $5,000, which again, $5,000 in 1921 money would be, you know, exponentially more today. Got in through a rear window. And apparently they said at the end of this story that the police suppressed the news. I guess for some reason maybe the police were investigating it, didn't want this to get out there originally. But, you know, so there's oodles of reporting about her being in Forest Hills and giving statements to the press from that home. Just another angle of it. So the home there was some, I couldn't really find a lot of information on it, so I'm not quite sure the extent of what happened here. There was a fire at the home. How much of the home it damaged, some was preserved, it's kind of unclear, but it was sometime obviously after she had moved out. And then there was a series of synagogues that were built on that site. So early 1950s was a synagogue was built, and then some of these synagogues started to merge and became what's now the Reformed Temple of Forest Hills. So, it's not quite clear again, like how all that, like she was very famous at the time, so I'm surprised that there wasn't more news coverage, and maybe she existed in a place that I didn't see about the home being torn down. Maybe it was again a time when we were not yet in New York City in like the 60s is when a big preservation movement started with the destruction of Grand Central Terminal. So I don't know if maybe that's why just people didn't think at that point of like saving her house. She was still alive, so maybe it was just sort of like, oh, it's not that big a deal. But luckily, unlike some of these other sites, there is a plaque honoring it at the Reform Temple. So if you look at the facade, there is something there for at least people who would come from out of town to visit, who want to have some sort of, sign of what was there. There is some recognition. Also in recent years, they've put some murals on Ascan Avenue. If you go by the underpass, there are some murals that include a photograph of the home and Helen Keller's face and a quote of hers. So yeah, that's a little bit on her time first. Now this next one, we said you already knew a little bit about this place, or maybe you'd even gone there a few times over the years because it's a much more public location. So, you know what these two things are? I imagine a lot of you, knowing Queen's history, would know. Yeah, this is the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair. These are the two icons of the World's Fair, the Trilon and the Perisphere. So, Trilon and Perisphere, which are located essentially where the Unisphere is today, the Unisphere that was built for the 1964-65 World's Fair. So obviously this triangular shaped object is the Trilon, and the Perisphere, this big round one. And so internationally known, there's still a lot of little memorabilia out there that have Trilon and Perisphere. There are salt shakers and all these sorts of pins and things that still exist. And you can kind of still see the faint outline of where the Trilon was on the ground in Flushing Meadows Park, which is kind of neat. But they were designed as temporary structures, as a lot of World's Fair icons are, but they inspired a lot of other architecture and similarly named businesses in Queens. One of them was the Trilon Theater. So that's why I wanted to show the actual Trilon Perisphere and then look at the Trilon Theater, which outlived it. So there are other businesses, again, that were popping up at that time. There were the Trilon Cleaners that was right next door to the theater. But the Trilon Theater, which existed for 60 years, it was around a little bit longer than the actual physical building, but it stopped showing movies in 1999. So named after Trilon Perisphere from the World's Fair, which we just saw. 600-seat theater, obviously an era where there was one screen, in a theater, unlike these 5-plex, 6-plex, all these multiplexes today. Fabric-covered walls, satin wood, so kind of like not quite the movie palace of an RKO Keith's in Flushing, but still evoking a kind of nice marquee. And I'll show you obviously a bunch of these photos. It closed after 60 years and was converted into a synagogue. So here's an early photo of the Trilon. Based on the movies on the marquee, this seems to be from its very first year, 1939, because some of the films that they're showing there were released in summer or fall of 39. So you see some of the top stars of that era, like Ralph Bellamy, Barbara Stanwyck. And then you have Don Amici again, showing up in this movie, Hollywood Cavalcade. And Golden Boy, I included the poster over there. I don't know if you can kind of see it here, but faintly on the side here is another Trilon business that is on the side, and I believe this may have been the Trilon Cleaners. So that's I'm going to show you a little bit more of the interior detail, and this glass block was like kind of an iconic thing for many years. Do you remember?
There was also to the left in that picture Trilon Realty.
Okay, that's right.
That day.
I had seen when I was doing some research and I was trying to find like old ads for the Trilon Theater, I saw the Trilon Realty showing up as well. So that's pretty neat. And of course those things were outliving the World's Fair, so still like some recognition of our history. Unfortunately, a lot of those businesses now are no more. This is some early photos of what the inside of the Trilon Theater looked like. So these, I know you could not possibly read this even for me up here and stuff, but it's saying the auditorium looking toward the rear shows more strikingly the almost circus-like effect that they had inside there. So you can see what that one screen looked like a little on the side. I have some better photos and some color photos coming up, but these are the earliest ones. This, I believe, is from a pamphlet that came out in 1941. So it's showing it from the very, very early years. This is one of the best photos I found of the ticket booth and the kind of area outside, which you'll see this a little bit closer later on, but the chevrons that they had in the mosaic tile on the bottom. There's actually a trilon there, and a trilon that looks exactly like the one at the World's Fair was on the mosaic, and that was in existence until we'll come to what ended up happening after it closed down in '99. But pretty nice picture there at the entrance. Here's the close-up of the tile that was on the floor there with the chevrons, mosaics that we don't really get too much anymore. There's I know the flash isn't great on this one, but showing you the trilon, you know, that when you would get your tickets, that would be right at the ticket booth. Here's inside the Trilon Theater. There were a bunch of murals that were painted. And so here's one. This was taken around 2005 when they were starting to demolish the Trilon. So unfortunately, these things didn't survive. And this is showing the destruction of the mosaic tiles that they had in there, including the ticket booth. And so now, this is after 1999, this is around the time that I became a reporter. I started as an intern at the New York Daily News in the fall of 2005, and this was the state of the Trilon Theater around that time, where they had stripped the marquee. There was plans to turn it into this Russian synagogue, but they hadn't really done anything yet, and preservationists were trying to preserve the facade at the very least, although also we saw they wanted this Center for Russian Jewry, I believe it was called, they wanted them to also preserve the interior. It seemed like that wasn't going to happen, but there was at least thought about maybe we could preserve the glass tower and some of the Trilon lettering and all of that. So I remember actually the very first story I ever wrote for the Daily News in October of 2005 was a rally to save the Trilon Theater. And this is a photo from that day. And you see now there was Trilon Vet Care, an animal clinic over there. You see some of these preservationists rallying outside and signs. And so I included this. This was the first article that I wrote in the 2007 series for the Daily News, History in Peril, where I was really shook by some of these developments when I first started reporting and seeing all of these places being destroyed. Queens, always in the shadow of Manhattan, not really getting the kind of attention that that Manhattan and then to another lesser extent Brooklyn has gotten, I think, over the years. And so it's really sad to see some of these icons destroyed. So we use this photo to try to start showing the Landmarks Preservation Commission, the city agency that is supposed to be protecting these kinds of sites, trying to tell them, you know, we need to start paying attention to the outer boroughs a little bit more. And then just to kind of move it into some of these other things that happened, you know, at the Daily News. So I wrote that story about, you know, the importance of landmarking in general. And again, a lot of you, if you're here today, you probably know something about New York City's landmarks history. But the destruction of Grand Central Terminal led a lot of people, including Jackie Onassis, to be very concerned about the state of New York's old landmarks and icons. In 1965, there were calls to start a Landmarks Preservation Commission under the mayor's office, which then would be charged with identifying sites of architectural, cultural significance, and protecting them from demolition. And if anybody was to try to make some sort of a change to it, they would have to go through a process of approvals. And so if you want to change that mosaic tile booth, you would have to get approval from the city from that. So I also then looked at that time, and these are places that are outside of Forest Hills, but I was looking at other places that could have been saved that fell to the wrecking ball throughout Queens. I do quickly mention Al Jolson there, in this story. But this runs down the gamut. There's the Helen Keller house, so there are some of the allusions to the Forest Hill stuff. But I also covered things there, like these are wrestlers at an old arena, Sunnyside Garden, that used to be on Queens Boulevard. So that's a wrestler named Haystacks Calhoun, who would come out in overalls and beat up folks, a guy from Texas. And there's an old poster from that. This is the former home of Jacob Riis, that was in Queens. So a lot of other places that I kind of briefly mentioned there, but I was trying to call to attention the fact that these are sites that if only the preservation movement had been around a few decades earlier, maybe some folks would have thought about it. In a lot of these cases, we're living in a city that is evolving so quickly, where development is happening, sometimes even before the people who lived in those homes rise to fame, and then we realize, like, oh man, that was the childhood home of such and such. I think with Helen Keller, again, if there was a fire there, then that's not really on anyone. It's just like a fortunate act of God, but there would have been more of an opportunity, or say, like, let's put something here to honor that person. So I was going to end here with a few more positive, uplifting kind of stories, since we did talk about places that we lost that are sad. But again, as part of this series that I was writing for the Daily News, I was looking at a bunch of places I thought really deserved a closer look from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. One of them was the Ridgewood Theater on Myrtle Avenue. So around this time, the theater closed. I remember being really bummed out because I had heard that it was kind of in disrepair, but it was still running movies, and I would have liked to have gone to see something, and I never went in there. And I was like, oh man, it would have been, cool to see the inside of this theater, and even the exterior was pretty nice. I was talking about landmarking before. Landmarking, there is interior landmarking, but for most of these buildings, they only get exterior. Interior is a lot harder to get done. So a lot of times they will preserve the facade of a building, but the inside of these glorious movie palaces will still be gutted, and you'll lose a lot of that wonderful stuff we saw at the Trilon or was at the Ridgewood. So I wrote this story, which at the time, when the Ridgewood Theater closed down in 2008, it was the longest continuously operated movie theater in the United States. Wow. And I thought that alone gives it, wow, this is really something that we should be looking into saving and sparing from the wrecking ball. And in a good way, I was at this point really hounding, what reporters can do is be persistent, keep calling people at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, hey, have you looked at this building? And so eventually Landmarks Preservation Commission put the Ridgewood Theater on its calendar of buildings to look at. There's a lot of politics that goes into this, the developers, there's a lot of talk about what the relationship is like between the developers and the city and how they get certain buildings taken off the agenda, or a city council member will say, nah, I don't want you to landmark that building. But in this case, the Daily News wrote a bunch of stories. Elizabeth Crowley, who was the local councilwoman, she agreed that she wanted this to be landmarked. And then I went to this hearing, which was really rewarding a few years later, where the city said, because of the Daily News' crusading reports was the language that they used, and persistence, and I wonder if persistence is almost like annoyance, like get off our backs about this building, that they said that they are going to landmark it. So it did become a New York City landmark, which was really neat. And it wasn't just because of the Daily News. There were a lot of other preservationists who were calling for this. And but it was nice to know that was something that got landmark status. The other one that was a success of this series, there were two things. I wrote about, I think it was 14 buildings, 15 buildings that I thought should be preserved as landmarks. Two of them ended up getting landmark status that the city cited us for. The other one was the former home of Jackie Robinson, the Brooklyn Dodgers player who integrated baseball in 1947 and lived in Adderley Park during a time when he won the MVP award in the National League in 1949. So again, these are not just homes where these people happened to live, but where they were living during landmark years, milestones in their career, like when they were most famous. In Jackie Robinson's autobiography, he talks about living in this house at a time when he was becoming so famous that people were starting to camp out on the lawn, trying to get a photo of him, trying to get an autograph and see him. And he says something like, well-meaning people are out there, but him and his wife Rachel, this is when they were just starting their family, So their young kids would remember this. At the time that I wrote this story, I was actually able to interview Rachel Robinson, his wife, who's still alive, which is awesome, to talk to her about it. And so the children were still alive, who also were advocating for this. And I'm sure, again, some of you may know, but at Islay Park, not only Jackie Robinson, there were many, many famous black entertainers, athletes, who lived in this area, a lot of jazz musicians, and, so it wasn't just him. And eventually, through all of this promotion of it, and most of these homes are still preserved, and you can go see them today. I also wrote about another home that was in the same district where W.E.B. Du Bois was married. He married someone who I believe was 51 years his junior, late in his life. But there's newsreel footage of that, which is kind of neat that this happened. This is something where I wrote that story about it, and then a few years later, in typical Daily News headline style, Jackie Pad may become landmark. Like, pad. That's kind of funny. So then eventually there was a push to not only see with the Ridgewood Theater, they just landmarked that one building. With Islay Park, they declared an entire historic district, meaning that all of the homes, even the ones that may not have a tie to a very famous individual like Jackie Robinson, are preserved because the whole character of the community we want to save. So that's one. And when I was looking back at some of these articles, and I saw that I interviewed the people who actually bought the home from the Robinson family at the time. And I don't know how I tracked them down. They had since moved to like Alabama or something, and I found them and was talking to them about it. And I remember going into the city finance office where they keep all the old deeds. And it was kind of cool, like I'm looking through all these like addresses and actually finding like Jackie Robinson's signed name on a deed to the home. So you could pretty much, when you're looking for like corroboration, So that's my little spiel about like some of the places that we've lost, but hopefully ending on like some positives of places that we can still go to see, including Frank Erickson's home. I know we're all going to go over there right now to honor the mobster. But those are some of the places. So I have the books for sale if you're interested for $20. I also always put the QR code there if you happen to want to buy it on Amazon. But thank you, and if you have any questions or thoughts, I'd love to talk to you.
Tell us about Near's Tavern.
About who?
Near's Tavern. They're trying to get.
Oh, Near's Tavern?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know a ton about Near's Tavern. I know for a long time it's been considered like one of the oldest watering holes, right? The oldest bar in New York City, or it's had like a debate with like some other bars. Is it technically the oldest? And I know Near's Tavern was also they filmed some of the scenes for Goodfellas in Near's Tavern.
And they're trying to get landmark status.
And are they trying to get it now?
Oh, you didn't know that?
Yeah, no, I didn't. I mean, I know that like that discussion has been going on for a long time. I didn't know. Are there recent efforts to try to renew that?
It's been going on for quite a while. Yeah, I think De Blasio intervened because
he actually one of the only good things he did was get the rat reduced.
Oh, it's so they could stay. Yeah. I mean, Near's Tavern. I was talking to my wife about it because we want to go there and have a meal there at some point. But every time that I try to go there, it's not that big and it gets very crowded.
You gotta make it.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, we want to see these places do really well.
Yeah.
There's so many other sites I could have included in here too. I was thinking about, now these are places that still are preserved. I grew up and lived near Eddie's Sweet Shop on Metropolitan Avenue in Forest Hills. And I always grew up concerned that something's gonna happen to Eddie's because all these other icons of our community are closing down. There was talk about the Cinemark closing for many years. And it's and now obviously the Cinemark has changed so many times over the years. It opened in 1925 as the Metropolis. And had a few other name changes, the Inwood for a period, and then eventually, became now the Cinemark Fiveplex. I think is it 5? Is it more now? I think it's 5. At least that still remains. And but the Cinemark does not have the architectural detail or delights of something like Eddie's, which would be a classic interior landmark, right? Because the outside is neat, but it's weird when you go inside where you're like a movie or it's still. It has the Little Rascals pictures and all that stuff, which is really, really cool. I was also thinking as I was going through the book a little bit right before our talk about the Forest Hills Theater on Continental Avenue that no longer exists, but it was a Duane Reade for a while. And I don't know, is it now just empty, I think? I don't think there's anything that's in there. And of course, to a lesser extent the Brandon Theater, which was a more recent theater, but that was on Austin Street. But yeah, there are a lot of these places that, early on in the book, I mentioned, so the namesake of Ascan Avenue, Ascan Bacchus, was the first name actually of a farmer. And like his home existed up until the 1920s. Just those kinds of people whose names have filtered down to our, just our daily lives. Like we say, like, we're going on Austin Street, or going, who are these people? What is it named after? I also grew up, we were talking before about the Memorial Day Parade on Forest Hills that goes down Metropolitan Avenue and ends at Remsen Cemetery, where there's Revolutionary War veteran buried there. And the Remsen family home, although it was like nothing much to see, it wasn't like a grand house or on the scale of Helen Keller's, but it would have been amazing to have like the home of Revolutionary War veteran still there. And so seeing all these old photos of these places that end up, getting destroyed. So, but yeah.
Over like where Helen Keller or any of them done, what kind of buildings did they put up?
Well, Helen Keller, it was a vacant lot for a while, and then it became the temple. So now it's the Reformed Temple Forest Hills, which actually had won, I saw an architectural award from Queen's Chamber of Commerce. So there's that. The Al Jolson house became a McMansion. Just like
a different kind of big house.
Yeah, just another kind of house that I don't know. I feel kind of these houses look kind of gaudy and not like they seem out of place in the neighborhood, out of character with some of the other buildings. The Trilon Theater now they demolished that whole block, right? That also include the Tower Diner. And so I honestly I don't get around there that much. I haven't seen it. I know you know what's that?
Well, I think they actually named the building the Trilon.
Oh, they named the building.
I believe so. I mean, I live right there, I should look. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they named it the Trilon.
I mean, that would be, so is it a mixed-use building? Is it going to be like
Well, I can tell you right away, they're ripping down another block, a few blocks from me. I live on 67 Drive. Northwell Health moved to the bottom. The answer to your question is yes, Northwell Health is in the bottom, and it's going to be stores on the bottom. But that's the only one that's actually physically there.
Okay.
I think they're renting the building. I don't know if anybody moved in.
Well, it'd be nice if they at least preserve the name, right?
I'm almost 100% sure. I'm sure people have their phones out.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's always neat because that was one of the things when I don't know if I ever went to the movie. I was thinking about this. I think I told you that story once. That at the Trilon Theater, once when I was a kid, we went to go see The Truman Show, the movie with Jim Carrey, where he's like in a reality show. And we went to go see it, and we showed up to the Trilon Theater on a Saturday night. I was really excited. And the projectionist was outside the theater telling everybody the building is locked and I can't get in. And I guess the guy who was supposed, the manager was they couldn't reach him, so they had to cancel all the Saturday night movies. So that was going to be our one time going to the Trilon Theater. And I never got inside because that guy couldn't get there in time. But luckily I was able to go to the Elmwood Theater before it closed on Queens Boulevard years ago. Now it's the church, and I was there. I remember I went there as a reporter one time to cover an event when they were converting it into a church.
I always lived around there, and I do remember when I did go to the Trilon Theater, the very distinct ticket booth outside, and it wasn't centralized, as I remember. It was kind of oddly in the corner.
Yes.
You walked in front, right, and the thing sort of was to the side on the left, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it wasn't right in front of it.
Right, I think it's because there were some of the old theaters that did have right in the middle. It would make more sense, but it was kind of on the side. I was at the Trilon Theater again in 2005 for that rally, but that was only outside, and by that point they had already started chiseling away at the mosaics and everything in the tile. I'm sorry, you had a point.
Oh, I was just thinking when you were talking about the Keller and Al Jolson house being on the other side of Queens Boulevard. The actual gardens itself is owned by a corporation. And I think that's a good thing in the sense that they have to authorize whatever's done to the houses, and they even have to keep those red roofs. They're very rigid about it. So that wouldn't happen in that area as opposed to across the boulevard.
Exactly. They have restrictive covenants essentially, so that basically you cannot make certain changes, and that's why Frank Erickson is still around, probably. And Geraldine Ferraro's home in Forest Hills Gardens. There's a lot of famous people. Branch Rickey, who was the general manager for the Brooklyn Dodgers, who decided to make Jackie Robinson the first black player in the major leagues. He lived in Forest Hills Gardens. He went to Church of the Gardens. So a lot of those homes, yes, a lot of that architecture still remains, thankfully, in Station Square. The, yeah.
Right.
It's the photo of the, oh yeah, Trilon Tower. Oh wow, that's really cool. Wow, looks impressive. Yeah. I mean, that's neat. Yeah, that is neat. I'm glad that they are at least honoring the name. Because I do think, and growing up with things like that, with Trilon Tower, or the United Nations used to meet in Queens, what's now the Queens Museum. And growing up, there was like a United Nations Cleaners on Union Turnpike. I went to St. John's University for undergrad, and when I used to drive there was a little strip mall that had the United Nations Cleaners or something. You're like, United Nations Cleaners? Why here? What? And so it forces you to I'm going to look up something. Oh, the UN used to be here, and all these diplomats used to have homes around it. So yeah, I feel like that's always really fun. But yes, Forest Hills Gardens, thankfully, we've been able to preserve a lot of that stuff. The cover of my book shows Teddy Roosevelt speaking at Station Square in July 4th, 1917. And thankfully, Station Square still remains. You can still stand at that spot because it's part of that area that is protected. It's gorgeous. But of course, also because of the way Forest Hills Gardens is, it's not really built for tourism, right? We're not going to be turning any of those homes into museums. I mean, you could go walk by them, but if you park in front of them, you're going to get a boot on your car. So yeah, but because to me, that's always part of this is being able to preserve it and welcome people and say we're really proud of it and we want you to go not just see a mural or see a sign, which is nice, but someplace we can actually go inside and enjoy this history and keep inspiring people. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions, folks? Check?
I was just wondering how many of the people here are from Forest Hills. Okay. I'm from Kew Gardens.
Boo! No,
No, but I had a lot of students who lived in Forest Hills.
Kew Gardens has the Main Street cinemas.
Well, it's not the place that makes the person, it's the person that makes the place.
Definitely.
That's how I
No, not the growing Kew Gardens Hills. I mean, there's, it is sad to think about some of these places. There are still some of them that exist. So we still have a chance to make our voices heard and say that these are important places. And also, I didn't include it in here, but another great success story is the Forest Hills Tennis League.
Yes.
Because when I was a reporter, there was a lot of talk about destroying it. And I was covering that really, I remember they would have these votes at the tennis club, and there was one time where they were having this big vote about whether they should sell to a developer and tear down the building. And it was really intense deadline pressure where I was calling my desk at the Daily News and I'm trying to get the results of the votes, but they're in a closed door meeting and I'm trying to find out. And they thankfully voted down the one proposal, and now at least that it has a second life now as a concert venue, because that would be another people know Forest Hills is the home of the U.S. Open.
And 311 is overwhelmed with noise complaints.
Yes,
yeah, well, there's that too.
They're split. The community's split with that noise complaint.
Yeah. Now that certainly has become an issue now in the community, but the fact that the building remains.
Yeah.
And I remember at that time I had an interview with somebody who was representing the Forest Hills Stadium. They said, because I was talking about preserving it and how they wish that it could be the International Tennis Hall of Fame, which already exists in Newport, Rhode Island. The casino, which was known as the casino, which also had been a home of the U.S. Open. And they said that someone from Newport, because I was thinking, well, are they helping you in any way? And they said, well, someone from Newport called and said, when they tear down the Forest Hills Stadium, can you give us some of the concrete eagles that are on the top? And it was are you kidding me? You vulture? You're just literally you're just waiting for them to tear down our building so you can take some of our eagles? No, we're keeping them here. So yeah, but I'm glad that, now that, because when I was growing up, that was a vacant stadium. It was just I would pass by on the Q23 and it would just be empty, abandoned. And so at least it's still there, it has a chance to be preserved for longer. But yeah.
You're
So,
too young, I went there to see the tennis match.
yeah, I mean, by the time I was born, the tennis was gone there. I went there in 2003 when they opened it up one day, and they brought back some of these tennis stars, including Michael Chang, to play, and that was neat. to go inside again. And now I've been there, for a few of the concerts. But yeah, that would have been a real travesty to tear down the tennis stadium.
There is still tennis facilities right next door, but I think one of the biggest drawbacks in terms of the community, and also being a world, stage literally, is that they actually don't have really good any bathroom facilities from what I understand, and I've been there, so that's
really?
difficult. And as the community become more active, that noise is actually a concern because there's more people coming through. But this is where the community board and community members come in and see if there are other suggestions, because there's fabrics for soundproofing. I mean, they have no roof,
Right.
So there's a lot of things, but we have to understand what's going on.
Yeah. No, and I know it's definitely created some tension in the community of like how the music and all that. Yeah, for me, from like a historic preservation standpoint, and I went to the Newport Casino where they have the Tennis Hall of Fame just to see it and just like look down at Forest Hills is better than this. I'm going back where I'm from. But I mean, like to think of, and if you ever walk through the clubhouse at Westside Tennis Club, it's amazing to see the photos of the champions and all the trophies and that stuff. I mean, it's like, this is the history that I wish it was available to more people, because obviously you can only like kind of get in there on a, if you're like, say you're like interested in a tour or something, like it's kind of tough to get access sometimes if you know a member. But there's still these places that we can celebrate. So, well, thank you very much for all coming out here and your conversation. Thank you.